So let me just do, so welcome back everyone. This is our final panel, panel 8, Adapting Asian Art and Performance. We are honored to have Dr. Sai Bhatawadekar, an associate professor for the Department of Indo-Pacific Languages and Literatures here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa as our moderator for this panel. She also teaches Bollywood dance, if you're interested in asking or learning more about Bollywood dance. And Dr. Bhatawadekar will be introducing our panelists.
Yes, hi everybody, and both panelists and audience members. I would urge you to, if it's okay to have your videos on, it would be nice to have everybody's faces. It's really nice to look at people and present. So my name is Sai Bhatawadekar, and I'm, language as well as performance studies. So I'm really excited about this panel. We can start with our first panelist, Elvis Galasinao Jr., de La Salle University, and the paper title is Serving You Pinay Queen Eleganza Extravaganza, Gender, Sexuality, and Technology in Drag Performances. So Elvis, yes, welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you very much, ma'am, and to all my panelists. Good morning. It's morning here in the Philippines. My name is Elvis Galasinao. I'm a graduate student of literature at the De La Salle University in Manila, Philippines. The title of my presentation is Serving You Pinay Queen Eleganza Extravaganza, Gender, Sexuality, and Technology in Drag Performances. I'm going to talk about my introduction, my method, and then findings, and lastly, my conclusion. Conceptualizing gender as performance suggests that a multiplicity of embodied identities can be created through body technologies. For instance, RuPaul's Drag Race alumna, Trinity the Tuck, blurs the stability of both gender and sexuality in her drag performances. In her RuPaul's Drag Race All-Stars performance, she parodies her feminized body by singing a song about tucking while revealing how she tucks her junk. At the end of her tucking tutorial number, she invited her audience members to examine her neatly tucked genitals. To this, Filipino-American drag queen Manila Luzon comments, "I think I've been doing tucking wrong this whole time." This speculum, as well as a plethora of waist, cincher, makeup, and elaborate costumes are the types of body technologies drag performers use to disturb straightforward interpretations of them as males. One of the things that I looked at when we wanted to define drag is the book of Roger Baker's Drag, A History of Female Impersonation in the Performing Arts. In this book, Roger defines drag as about many things. It is about clothes and sex. It subverts the dress codes that tell us what men and women should look like in our organized society. It creates tension and releases tension, confronts, and appeases. It is about role-playing and questions the meaning of both gender and sexuality. It is about anarchy and defiance. And the spread of images and videos from the show, Drag Race, and its performers has created the illusion of ordinariness, an illusory normality symptomatic of the need for online users to theatricalize the ambit of the everyday and to drag their bodies, which means that when they drag their bodies and when they post selfies online, they transform themselves or their bodies into a costume. RuPaul, the host of RuPaul's Drag Race, calls this as the drag phenomenon. Now, important in this study is gender, is a feminist scholar's work, Judith Butler, entitled Gender Trouble. Here she proposes the gender performance theory. To define, it suggests that it is a gender performance theory are acts, gestures, and desire produce the effect of the body through the play of signifying absences that suggest but never reveal the organizing principle of identity as a cause. In addition to this, Butler writes that it is the repeated stylization of the body, hence my paper, The Body Technologies That Drag Performers Use. It is a set of repeated acts within a highly rigid regulatory frame that congeal over time to produce the appearance of substance of a natural sort of being. And to define body technologies which alter the body is to change or alter our physical performance. Technologies of femininity refer to those knowledges, practices, and strategies that manufacture and normalize the feminine body. Those techniques, actions, and structures deployed to sculpt, fashion, and secure bodily shapes, gestures, and adornments that are recognizably female. And in my examples later, I'm going to talk about how these Filipino drag performers use body technologies in their drag performances. Method. This study is based on field notes made from regularly attending drag shows at a gay bar in Manila, from interviews with drag performers, and from binge-watching reality competition TV series such as RuPaul's Drag Race and the Bully Brothers Dragula. I was able to set up a face-to-face interview with two drag performers named Nikki Pinas and Michelle Facun. Findings. West and Zimmerman's study posits that although all body technologies are artificial, the technologized body passes as natural when it conforms to dominant social expectations of gendered bodies. Indeed, as visible accomplishments writ upon the body technologies can be acts of doing gender. In my interview with Nikki Penas, one of the Filipino drag performers that I was able to interview before the pandemic, Nikki Pinas talks about achieving illusions of femaleness using body technologies. She said other drag performers and the audience judge a drag queen based on realness. The audience expects drag performers to look like women as much as possible. Besides, other performers ridicule drag queens who fail to look feminine. Even from the popular culture where drag shows are patronized, fishiness is more prioritized and appreciated over butchness. When we talk about fishiness, it's the ability of looking female. And when we talk about butchness, it's the idea of looking masculine rather than achieving the female look, which means that in achieving illusions, Nikki Pinas wanted to emphasize the use of body technologies for them to be able to perform, because an example that I was able to get from my interview is when I was able to interview another drag queen named Michelle, Michelle Facun, who wanted to present herself with other gender performances instead of just looking fishy. And Michelle Facun, one of the drag performers, describes body technologies as: we present ourselves consistent with cultural expectations by squeezing ourselves into girdle and body shaper to have curves. We paint our faces using various makeup to hide our masculinity and reveal our inner drag. We contour most parts of our face to make it look like smaller, like a beautiful girl. Some even shave their eyebrows to fully commit to smoother facial features. I could tell you that the face alone is expensive to achieve. It usually involves more than 20 different types of makeup and it consumes a lot of time. Drag performers that I was able to interview have this opportunity to use a lot of body technologies because the Filipino drag performers that I was able to interview are not those drag performers who only performs drag because it's their hobby, but mainly because it's their way of living. They were paid to do this. That's why they have a lot of body technologies, and it's important for them to have these technologies to gain access to drag performances, to gay bars, and to acceptance, mainly when they perform. And when they wanted to perform gender using body technologies, one of the ways to do this in their performances is to have lip sync. Now, when we talk about lip syncing, these are the kind of female impersonation numbers that come to most people's minds when they think of drag. There is no critique of conventional ideas of femininity, although such numbers reveal the social basis of femininity and masculinity by showing that men can attain the feminine ideal, despite the fact that these performances appear to pay homage to feminine beauty, the fact that straight men find the drag queen sexy complicates heterosexuality. And in their performances, when they want, in most of their performances, they have these drag icons, they have these pop icons that they wanted to impersonate. For example, one of the most popular icons here in the Philippines that a lot of performers wanted to impersonate are icons such as Lady Gaga and Beyonce, for example. Now, besides lip syncing, one way of also performing gender is to have the idea of reading. When we talk about reading, it's a jargon used by drag performers, and I'm going to give you an example of reading. In my interview with Nikki, she gives an example of reading. I quote, I got this from Alaska, a drag race competitor. I can say this is an example of reading. Michelle, these other girls are gonna say you have terrible makeup skills, you have no fashion sense, and you're dumb as a rock. But they're wrong. You don't have terrible makeup skills. You see how much insult performers gain if they cannot achieve femaleness. And when we talk about reading, to the jargon, reading means it's a mock performance. They wanted to emphasize the lack of skills of other performers, and which means that the use of body technologies is that important to them, because if they do not achieve the idea of fishiness and they were not able to have that feminine look, then they'll be able to be criticized or to be read. But the idea of reading, the mockery performance, is that they wanted to highlight the idea of being male. Even if they look fishy, they look feminine, they do not want to change their voices, and sometimes they use play on words to be able to emphasize that they are still male, right? That they, for example, they use voices such as the masculine voice. They tell jokes about not being able to tuck their junk, for example, and they wanted to emphasize that they are still male and they laugh about it. And I think according to the drag performers, that's important to them. Reading is important to them because when you laugh at something, when you laugh at your weakness, for example, then that just takes out the power of that insult. Now, Rebecca Hanson on Total Freedom Drag Queens Have comments, they wanted drag queens can do anything and say anything. Now, this is now the access that I'm talking about, how drag performers using body technologies gain access to total freedom that they cannot able to achieve when they're not using drag, or when they're not performing drag. When they are drag performers, I can do anything and say anything. I'm no longer me. She can get away with anything. Sex is a very taboo subject. Drag queens can just throw it right out there and talk about it. They draw attention to it. Who better than a man transformed into a woman? Queens can point out the obvious and shine light on the obscure parts of sexuality, but in a humorous and entertaining way. Laugh at the queen and her jokes and songs instead of admitting your secrets. Time, realize others have the same secrets and desires. Drag is an open forum for a frank discussion of a very taboo subject with lots of uncomfortable subtopics. Queens can talk about it without being uncomfortable. And when we ask why drag queens are called queens, Michelle comments, of course, it's because we rule the world and of course the stage gorgeously when we are performing. We are the powerful agents of control in our bar. We order people around, we guide interactions. If an audience gets out of control, I can easily take care of him or her. We are the queens of the gay community and they treat us as such. I'm no longer the bullied Michael, that's the real name of the drag performer. I am the sexy, naughty, aggressive, flirtatious, and uninhabited Michelle. And best of all, I'm no longer invisible. Michelle is the center of attention. Nikki, as a drag performer, adds that drag is my artistic expression and body technologies are my tools. I am male, but I love to bring the inner female within me. People love to meet her. I am creating a separate personality. I also love the total freedom drag shows bring. I can say anything and I can do anything. The male me is no longer present. I'm the fabulous queen. She is gorgeous, uninhabited, flirtatious, aggressive, naughty, and sexy. People love me and I'm the center of attention. I could also help audience members take their minds off of the troubling news outside. Conclusions. The feminine appearance of drag performers alone challenges the naturalness of gender and the supposed inherent opposition of its dichotomous categories. As argued by scholars in this study, the makeup, hairstyles, the clothing, and mannerisms that comprise the category of female body technologies are as equally important as sex organs in defining a woman as female. The drag queens in this study have their bodies quite literally mean something to them to help them make sense of who they are. They clearly utilize body technologies to be competitive in the industry, but they also engage with body technologies to forget something, to prove something, to mark themselves, to numb themselves, and to make themselves feel, and a whole host of other reasons. Daily, hourly, minute by minute, these drag performers were refashioning themselves. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Elvis. This was amazing and incredibly under time, which never happens. I am very happy to introduce the next speaker, especially also because I moonlight as an East-West philosopher as well. My degrees are in cross-cultural philosophy, or one degree anyway. Here it is Griffin Werner, University of Hawaii at Manoa, who will speak about Nishitani Keiji and the 10 ox herding pictures, reimagining the overcoming of nihilism in modernity. Griffin.
Thank you. Just trying to share this right. Is that good? Thanks. Yeah, I didn't realize you were gonna be here. I was at the thing on Saturday. We may have just exchanged names really quick, right? You were there.
What did I do Saturday?
It was the undergrad thing, high school kids coming, Manoa experience.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I was sitting there with
Oh,
Sean
you were
and
sitting
Sarah,
next to Sean.
and I remember seeing you, and it was like, oh, this is somebody who was part of the department. It's so funny. Cool. All right, so yeah, so this is me, Nishitani, and the 10 ox herding pictures, reimagining the overcoming of nihilism in modernity. So in this presentation, I'm going to try to do three things. Introduce you to the 10 ox herding pictures from the Zen Buddhist tradition. Introduce you to Nishitani Keiji's philosophy of overcoming nihilism, and then articulate an interpretation of the 10 ox herding pictures through the lens of Nishitani's philosophy. And then this little bit at the end that I'll get to, hopefully. All right, so a practical and philosophical problem that Zen Buddhism deals with is the problem of the self in relation to the world. For instance, questions like, what is the nature of the self? Who am I? What is the nature of reality? These are questions that motivate people to join monasteries and or sit in the posture of zazen, which means meditation in Japanese. The Zen Buddhists' answer to those questions are not going to be expressed in the form of words, even though there are hundreds of years worth of writings on Zen Buddhism by Zen Buddhists and lay persons in Japan, the US, and around the world. Most people are trying to articulate what Zen really is all about. Will say that the answer to the question, what is Zen, what is the self, what is true reality, can't be answered with words. For the Zen Buddhists, it's the practice of zazen which answers the question. Their claim is that if you wholeheartedly engage in the practice of zazen, you will discover what Zen is, you'll discover what the self is, and you'll discover what the world is for yourself based on your own embodied experience. So in the 15th century, a form of Zen painting became popular, which expressed in images the path of the young monks struggling with Zen, the self, and their meditative practice. These images are known as the 10 ox herding pictures. Recent scholarship by Steve Odin, who's one of my advisors in the philosophy department here, has connected the ox herding pictures with the Kyoto school philosophers of the 20th century Japan. One of the Kyoto school philosophers, Nishitani Keiji, took up the problem of nihilism in his philosophy. And what I like to do is interpret the 10 ox herding pictures through the lens of Nishitani Keiji's philosophy in particular, and nuance Dr. Odin's points a bit. So first, let's look at the 10 ox herding pictures. I'm going to go over them as they're understood in the context of a new monk arriving to a Zen monastery and attempting to discover what the self is, what Zen is, and then by extension, what the world is. So one way to think of the paintings is that the simile of the ox and the herdsman is intended to help smooth the stepwise path, conceived mostly in these 10 stages, to insight into the true nature of things. Or put another way, all the different versions of the pictures are trying to compare the whole inner progress of Zen training to that to which Zen aims with the process of ox herding. Because there's like a bunch of different versions of if you Google 10 ox herding pictures images, you'll find a bunch of different versions of them. And they're all trying to kind of do that. Zen training and ox herding as like an analogy. So imagine that the ox herder in these pictures is a Zen Buddhist monk who's just arrived at a monastery. They come with questions. What is the nature of the self? What is true reality? How can I see true reality? It's in this sense that the first picture is called Searching for the Ox. This monk has read the sutras, heard about the figure of the Buddha, but can't make anything of the words. It's in this sense that they see the traces, which is picture 2, of the ox in what they have read, but understanding the concepts that are like in the sutras doesn't cause them to see true reality or understand the self really. And then pictures 3 through 6 involve seeing the ox and then taming it. So as one settles into their lives at the monastery, meditating, cleaning, and eating in an extremely rigorous, disciplined, and ritualized practice, one contends with themselves. Their sense of self seems to be split between the desire to know themselves, the desire to know true reality, and the fact that their mind seems to wander without their control. The wandering part of the mind that we can't control and use to see true reality of the true reality of the world and the self is represented by the ox. Or picture 7, the ox has been forgotten because the distinction between the self as monk and the wandering mind is ultimately a false one. The mind is whole, but coming to embody and live this fact is difficult to do without a sustained meditative practice. In picture 8, the man and the ox are gone. The monk discovers that not only is the dualism between the self and one's wandering mind in the form of the ox an illusion, but the dualism between oneself and the world is also an illusion. With respect to the fact that the world exists, the self and the world understood as a unity are negated in picture 8. There's nothing. Picture 8, and in Buddhism in general, has often been interpreted as nihilistic in the sense that everything is completely negated. The existence of the world and the existence of oneself, as it shows in picture 8. Picture 8 is also often interpreted as enlightenment, where one comes to understand that everything is empty of substantial being, both the world and the self, completely empty. However, there's a further stage represented by pictures 9 and 10. These stages involve a reaffirmation of the world and the self, but one that's informed by the understanding gained through picture 8, namely that everything is empty. The self is once again the self, and the world is once again the world, as it was in picture 1. But one is no longer operating with respect to the idea that those things are separate. Rather, one embodies the understanding that the self and world and others are an interconnected totality. In picture 10, one returns to society and engages with and through others with this understanding of the self and the world. So those are the 10 ox-herding pictures, understood as a tool to describe the progress of a Zen Buddhist monk practicing for the sake of enlightenment. And now I'm going to turn to Nishitani Keiji's philosophy. So Nishitani argues that the modern world suffers from the problem of nihilism. Nihilism has 2 dimensions. On the one hand, nihilism is something experienced by the individual when they discover, often through a tragic event like the death of a loved one, that they are finite and that any kind of ultimate meaning that they cling to, such as an all-powerful and loving God or one's material possessions, will not truly sustain them. When one confronts the fact that there is no certainty which one can cling to in order to support the meaning of one's life, Nishitani says that that person has plunged into the abyss of nihilism. On the other hand, nihilism is also an historical problem, which manifests at the level of the culture. The paradigmatic example that Nishitani uses, and the one that he thinks we are trying to pass through and overcome right now, or I mean 1960 when he wrote this, but probably also right now, is the quote unquote modern period of nihilism. This historical period of nihilism was brought on by what Friedrich Nietzsche called the death of God. So due to the death of God, we in the Western world started to see ourselves as cut off from the natural world and superior to it. We started industrializing, treating the land, the environment, and each other as objects of consumption, rather than other beings just like us that are deserving of respect and dignity. In order to solve the problem of nihilism so that we can reacquire a harmonious relationship with nature and each other, Nishitani argues that we need to overcome the problem of nihilism. Nihilism involves a negation of the world and the self. We negate the reality of the world, or we experience a negation in the world, such as the death of a loved one. And this triggers us to negate the self as well, as if our very sense of self was wrapped up in the person who died, or the belief system which no longer sustains the foundational meaning of our lives. For Nishitani, this is a relative negation with respect to being. It's the negation of the world and the self together with respect to the idea of being as a whole, a relative nothingness, if you will. Nishitani argues, instead of finding some other source of meaning, like another person, more things, or a new belief system, we need a further negation, or an absolute negation, of the very dichotomy between being on the one hand and relative nothingness on the other. This double negation leads one to what Nishitani calls the field of emptiness, a standpoint from which the world and being is affirmed, but is affirmed without the dualism between the self and the world, or the self and that which sustains the meaning of our lives as two different things. It's an affirmation of the interdependent totality of the self with the world as both empty of foundational meaning. Instead of having a new foundational ground which temporarily staves off a confrontation with nihilism, emptiness as the field of emptiness is a groundless ground, which is a perspective from which Nishitani believes modern problems like nihilism, environmentalism, and others can be solved. So if we apply Nishitani's philosophy to the 10 ox herding pictures, I think we get an interesting picture of what a Zen Buddhist-esque path to overcoming nihilism might look like. So firstly, as the 10 ox herding pictures are meant to depict the challenges of a monk whose aim is to practice Zazen to attain enlightenment, for Nishitani, everyone, whether they know it or not, is confronting nihilism and is somewhere between images 1 through 7. So as we go through our lives, we experience events which make us aware of the abyss of nihility which exists at our feet. In the modern world, Nishitani argues that consumerism is a symptom of the modern problem of nihilism. Since we don't have a foundation to cling to, we turn to consumerism to fill this void. Whether or not we are aware of the reality of nihilism, the modern world is always already providing us with distractions to call us away from confronting our personal nihilism. In this sense, we can understand the ox from the 10 ox herding pictures as not the wandering mind that we are trying to get under control, but as our subconscious desire to find something that is going to provide us with foundational meaning, whether that be in things, other people, or belief systems. At picture 8, which is the complete negation, ourselves as well as the object of meaning are negated together as we plunge into nihilism in the form of a relative negation in Nishitani's terms. In the previous interpretation, this relative negation is a kind of enlightenment or realization, which then leads to stages 9 and 10, where one affirms being. For Nishitani, however, I'd say that one does not so easily go from the relative negation of picture 8 to 9 and then to 10. Rather, since we're living in a historical period of nihilism, there's so much about the world that entices us to return to pictures 1 through 7 once we experience 8. So for instance, one's partner dies, or we have a crisis of faith and leave the religious community we have been a part of our whole lives. This leads us to the abyss of nihilism, where the self and object are negated, picture 8. But the world of capitalism and consumerism, the world of cheap fixes to existential problems, entice us back somewhere among pictures 1 through 7. Maybe we form a new relationship, or we find a new kind of spiritual awakening. We go back to picture 1, where we are searching for something meaningful, or maybe we even abandon the path altogether and commit to a form of meaning that we know isn't sustainable, but we cling to it anyway so that we don't experience that relative negation represented by picture 8 again. For Nishitani, I'd argue that due to the fact that we're living through a historical period of nihilism, we are constantly oscillating between and among pictures 1 through 8. We don't have the luxury of being in a sustained, rigorous, ritualistic environment like a Zen monastery to keep us focused and continuously deepening our Zazen practice in order to relatively linearly proceed from pictures 1 through to picture 10. We are more or less on our own, trying to make sense of the world and what kind of lives we think will bring us meaning and fulfillment. Regarding the initial descriptions of pictures 9 and 10, they more or less align with Nishitani's philosophy. But in this next move, I want to kind of problematize Nishitani's philosophy a bit in order to further problematize the standard interpretation of the 10 oxirating pictures. So here's 9 and 10. I think that picture 9 should be understood as the absolute nothingness or emptiness from Nishitani, where the world and self are affirmed in their interdependence, like what was described with a monk as well, the original interpretation. But picture 10 is not limited to that, I don't think. Insofar as picture 10 involves returning to society, it involves returning to society with the understanding that the world needs to change in order for the historical problem of nihilism to be solved. For Nishitani, as I've hinted at a bit, there's an intimate relationship between nihilism and mechanization in the modern world. Because of the death of God and industrialization, we treat other people and the natural world as mere objects, dead matter for our use and consumption. In our historical context, I'd argue that solving the problem of nihilism is not just about individuals overcoming nihilism by way of experiencing nihilism and then overcoming it to an absolute nothingness or emptiness, but society as a whole doing it together. Individuals need to come to nihilism and overcome it to emptiness, but making political and material changes in the world is important as well. Picture 10 for Nishitani would then involve going back to society and engaging with others in order to help them overcome nihilism and come to the field of emptiness and eventually make the changes necessary for the overcoming of nihilism on a historical level to occur. Not only does nihilism need to be overcome, but those social and political structures which perpetuate nihilism also need to be overcome. When people are too worried about survival, worried about basic needs like food, shelter, healthcare, and education, they don't have the luxury to contend with the foundational meaning of their lives. The 9th oxirating picture involves affirming the world in its interdependence. And then I think the 10th involves working to change the world so that others can see it that way too. That's it. Thank you.
That was my timer. Sorry.
Nice.
Yes, nice indeed. Thank you, Griffin. I'm just trying to create threads in my mind as I hear your papers of whether it's about sort of creating an illusion or destroying an illusion of how you define yourself or refuse to define it. That's basically where my mind is going between paper number 1 and 2, right? Creating illusions, destroying, challenging, as well as creating a sense of self that is different from how it was understood previously. I think that's the connection I'm seeing between drag performance. Sorry to bring them together, but this is a panel, so that's what I'm trying to do. Okay, we go to paper number 3. And I'm already sort of sensing a thread between paper number 2 and 3, which is the dehumanization of nature and kind of commodification, something that came up in your paper, Griffin. But I could be completely wrong. The paper number 3 is Guanrui Gong from University of Colorado Boulder, and the title of the paper is Birds and Beasts and Dots and Strokes: Dehumanized Nature in Early Medieval Chinese Calligraphic Criticism.
Thank you so much for introducing me. So here I'm going to share. Yes, do this. Thank you so much for being here. So my paper title today is already read by Professor here. Before I begin my presentation, I want to show, first of all, some pictures of Chinese calligraphy. So calligraphy entails beautiful way of writing. And in sort of the Chinese tradition, there are different ways like different scripts. So standards are different. For example, here, the seal script, like it looks like something like this. So these two are the same text. And if you write it in clerical script, it's more square. But then we come to cursive script, it's like totally wild out there. Like you can't recognize without some training what this character is. So this is a basic idea of calligraphy. But my topic today is actually calligraphic criticism. So this is a group of texts, we can call it a genre of texts that discuss calligraphy. They argue about what is good calligraphy, right? They argue about whether this writing is good. They argue about what it means to write beautifully. Well, do we require people to write beautifully? If this person writes a nice article, but the writing itself, like the character isn't that good, will we call that good? So this is the group text that discuss this sort of questions. So it's called calligraphic criticism. I use this term, I model this term on the term literary criticism. So it's like the literary criticism, like they discuss literature. So here, this kind of criticism discusses calligraphy. So calligraphic criticism is not a well-developed field in sort of Chinese studies. Often this kind of text share a lot of similarities with music criticism, like texts that discuss calligraphy, discuss music, or texts that discuss art, paintings. So these kind of texts usually feature a lot of depictions of nature. And this is where my interest in eco-criticism or animal studies come in. And this term marries some explanation as well, like what do we mean when we talk about eco-criticism or environmental studies? So I narrow it down to these sort of questions I show on the screen here. First, I consider the question, how are animals or natural landscapes are represented? So what, like when we see this imagery of nature, what kind of image is this, right? Is it beautiful? Is it joyful? Or is it sort of anxious or fearful? Okay, so this is a line of question. And another, like I would also ask, why use animals and natural landscape to describe calligraphy among all the other ways, right? And then why these animals and these natural landscapes? What are so special about them? And are there human traces in natural landscapes? Is this a totally non-human land? What are we seeing here? And another my approach to this text, this is intimately connected with my interest in literature, a scholar and student of literature. So how are these animals or natural landscapes written about? What kind of language do we use? What style do we use? What tone do we use when we talk about them? And how do we incorporate our natural environment into our rhetoric, right? How do we talk about animals how do we say them with a sort of rhetorical pattern or strategy? So this is my sort of the literature part of the project. So this is a sort of, the two texts I'm going to discuss today, they both come from this same larger text. As you can see here, this is like super long. There's no need to, on the interest of time, I don't have time to go through it all. But you can see here as my translation here. So there are 4 scripts depicted here. And then the first, there are ancient script, clerical script, seal script, and cursive script. We've seen like the images of 3 scripts earlier. So the first script I'm going to discuss is the seal script. So you can remember it's like those like squares, like kind of with kind of they are more square than the later cursive script. So this is the first text I'm going to delve into today. So I'm going to read this passage out loud. If you read Chinese, feel free to read the corresponding Chinese on the left, but if not, I've translated here. And when I'm reading this, I want to encourage you guys to try to visualize the images, right? These are images of nature, and just see what image, what kind of imagery you conjure up. Yeah, so I'm gonna read it slowly, pay attention to the images in here. Here, the strokes are like the patterns or tortoise shell that are arranged densely like needles stacked together. How tightly they are squeezed together is like the scales of a dragon placed closely to each other side by side. As it relaxes its torso and unleashes its tail, the long and short strokes envelop its body. The strokes fall down like the dangling tips of millets, or are piled on top of one another like textiles tangled together like insects and snakes. The rising right falling strokes and the vibrating left falling strokes are like a falcon stands erect and a bird of prey stirs. They stretch their necks and contract their wings, ready to soar into the clouds. So as you can see here, we have a series of images here. We have from man-made or human-made objects. We have imagined animals. Then we have natural millets, right? We have natural grain, and we have creatures that are born, raised, like they grow up in nature itself. And then at last we have falcon bird. So all these images here, these are all still images. And then we move to this kind of dynamic image here. Well, a note of here is that these are dynamic images, but the animals are not moving right now. It's like the moment before moving. There is this sense of tension, anxiety. They're about to move, they will, but they haven't moved yet. And then here, they use these images are connected with the shape of the strokes. So it's like how strokes are shaped together, like kind of, they're kind of continuous, and sometimes they stop. And then here we have this, this dynamic image here, we have this sense of energy and movement here. Another thing, speaking from the perspective of literature, I would like to point out that these images, they are all isolated points from our environment. So we don't see them, we don't see the attempt here, right, in the text, by this text, to try to place them in the same setting. It's more like, hey, we have needles, hey, we have dragon, hey, we have some falcon birds. So it's like points from the environment. These are isolated points. So by creating this kind of points, this text offers us this kind of luxury of staying in our home, just watching this. We're not in the same setting as them, and these are not even in a setting with each other. So there is this sense of distance here. So we're outside the picture because there is no picture to begin with. So we're looking at them, but we're not participating in them. And this sense of this idea is extended in this paragraph, in this passage as well. I still want to read this out loud, and I want to encourage you to see the beautiful imageries depicted in this passage. There, the delicate touch of the brush is cast inward, so that the start of a stroke is fine and the ending thick, so that it appears to be broken and there to be continuous. It resembles dewdrops on fine willow branches, gathering and weighing the branches down at the end. The vertical strokes are as if suspended from above, and their horizontal ones are like plates woven together, masked and mysterious, all center-oriented. They're neither square nor round. They appear to be walking or flying, and they wriggle or flutter. So again, here we have two distinct images. We have fine willow branches, the dewdrops on them. Then we have this kind of little insect or bird. They appear to be walking or flying, like they're moving. So again, we have this combination of still images and moving images. Notice here, the text does not specify what animal it is, but rather it just describes the movement. So there is a sense that it's the movement that the text is emphasizing instead of the animal itself. It does not seem to matter what kind of animal it is, but rather their movement. And again, we see here, these are separate images, just isolated from the environment. So we don't see them placed in the same setting. And all these images from the previous passage and this one, we see them as, if not comforting, they're at least safe and familiar to us, right? We have dewdrops, this kind of elegant images. So this kind of elegant, comforting images, I would argue that these are created through these images itself, but also a way to do that by putting them, placing a distance between us audience and these images themselves. And So this is the next text I'm going to sort of talk about today. So this is come at the end of the article, end of the essay. Is this about the cursive script? So as like the one with like the picture before, like totally wild. We don't know what character it is. So and this passage here, I'm going to read this quickly. But again, there is still try to think about how the images in this passage differ from the images we see in previous passages. When we observe the models and images of the cursive script, there is propriety no matter from which angle we look. The rectangular forms do not match the square, and the round ones do not accord with the compass for drawing circles. Lowered on the left and raised on the right, it looks like a leaning precipice. A bird stands on tiptoe and stretches its neck in an erect position, intent on flying off. A ferocious animal suddenly recoils with fear, poised to race away. So instead of like the elegant images we saw before, these are pretty disconcerting images, right? So like it's full of anxiety and fear. And if we think about this in terms of the images of cursive script, it actually makes sense, right? It's not about creating clarity in itself, but it's the sense of creating this wilderness, this wildness out there, so that it matches what we perceive in the cursive script. And another thing I would like to point out is the rhetorical pattern in this passage. So we see here, so this first few lines here, they discuss the abstract principle or description of calligraphy. So like the cursive script, right? So like this is the principle of that. But then here, this creates a leaning precipice. So it creates this environment and it places reader in that environment. So readers cannot escape here. This is a like disorienting affect here. We're in the environment and we see all these animals. So this passage strips reader of the comfort from home. It puts reader in that environment. There is a sense of reader has to do this. It refuses to relax, to let the readers relax. So we see that. And again, we see this rhetorical pattern again, and in this passage. So for example, here are dots and dabs, and all these images, the harboring anger and dejection. There are strokes innermost recesses with anxiety and fear, a withered tree that leans towards the edge of a cliff, or like a cicada clinging to a branch. So there is a sense of not, again, we see here, this is sort of the abstract principle. We have the affect, the environment, and then again, we see the animal. So this is, again, we have a refusal of relaxing the reader, puts reader in the environment, encourage reader to feel the anxiety as they read calligraphy or the text. And I would like to end, and for this point, we talk about, my title is Dehumanized Nature. So in all these passages, we don't see any human trace, right? We see all these animals and natural landscapes. And I would like to argue that this is a sense of putting human as subjects versus animals as objects. So this is not a purely us versus other, but more like who's looking, who's gazing, who's being seen. So who's looking, we humans are looking, not just as animals, but also as calligraphy. So in this sense, they are all objects. And then and we are subject, we're exerting control over our viewing, our viewing of the world, our control of the environment. And I would like to end my presentation with this couplet from the text. I've merely approximated its general appearance, such as its configuration, more or less. So I would like to say that these images of nature, they fascinate me, but I don't want to say that I can completely understand them. So I welcome your suggestions and comments. If you're interested in environmental studies or nature itself, please feel free to ask me questions, comments. I thank you so much for your time, attention, and thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you so much for that very imaginative paper. It gave very beautiful and complex images and gave our imagination a lot of room to play with. Our next paper is by Karis Ryu from Yale Divinity School. The title of the paper is On Both Sides of the Camera, the Autonomous Photography of Lao Monks in the Buddhist Archive. The floor is yours.
I think your audio has some trouble, Carius. Okay, Carius will be on in just a minute. She's going to switch to her iPhone.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Great. Okay. Yes, I'm switching. There's been some audio issues, but hello, everyone. I'm about to share my screen and we can get started. All right. So hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Faris Liu, and I am a graduate student at Yale Divinity School. And I'm excited to present what began as my undergraduate capstone research developed and articulated further for you today. So based in Luang Prabang, Laos, the Buddhist Archive is a collection of over 35,000 photographs found in 19 distinct collections from the city's monasteries beginning circa 1880 to the present. Curated by Hans-Georg Berger, Sa Kamsan Viratita Mahatela, and others, the photographs range from presenting a view from inside on monastic life and rituals to holding a mirror to 20th century Laos's contentious political environment. So in this paper, I analyzed 4 photographs from the Buddhist archive taken by Lao monks for how they indicate the significance of Lao monk photographers as documenters of pictures and landscapes, and also as creators of personal and collective forms of identity and culture. So in this paper, I propose and define 3 terms. 1, autonomous photography, 2, disruption, and 3, construction. So autonomous photography, I propose, occurs when the subject of the picture is also responsible for or related to the taking of the picture. And in colonial and post-colonial contexts, available photographic resources are often not autonomous and are primarily the visualizations of Western gazes, which flatten the quote-unquote foreign subjects of their images into one-note caricatures. Meanwhile, audience acknowledgement of autonomous photography when we are able to witness it and when we are able to see it occurs through 2 proposed steps. So first, through perceiving how the photography disrupts preconceived concepts of photographs, in this case, Southeast Asian photographs. And second, how the photography then constructs independent visions. So Lao monks' authorship of their own images establishes them as self-aware agents of their own histories within the monastery, in political movements, and in the larger world. And it demonstrates the creative potential of photography as a tool of empowerment. So this paper, to preface, is also undergirded by theoretical frameworks of scholars such as anthropologist Janet Hoskins, ethnographer Jeffrey Samuels, and anthropologist Karen Strassler. So Hoskins analyzes the colonial postcard as a form of media that, in its essence, perpetuates the conquest and expansion of the peoples and region it presents. And Samuels interprets Douglas Harper's idea of breaking frames in order to explain how, while Harper, in his original study, used this concept as a way to enable his human subjects of study to engage with their materials, Samuels found that in his interactions with Sri Lankan monks, it was Samuels himself who underwent the process of having his own frame broken as a Western ethnographer in learning from the Sri Lankan monks and how they were dealing with their materials. So I bring that because that can inform our interactions with the photographs in this archive as a Western audience. And lastly, Strassler's work with Chinese photographers in 19th century Indonesia informs us how marginal groups in a society can use photography to impact larger scale societal perceptions of people and landscape. So these 3 primary concepts help us in approaching the 4 example photographs in this paper. So I present the first 2 photographs as examples of autonomous photography being disruptive. So this first photograph was taken by a monk photographer of two fellow monk photographers, all from Luang Prabang during the 1970s. The Buddhist archive describes that the two monks, shown setting up the camera that faces the photographer, are preparing to take a photograph of an approaching train during a voyage in Thailand. So first, the caption itself gives way to some key observations concerning travel and technology. The fact that monks were traveling throughout Southeast Asia, often to other monasteries, demonstrates a form of travel and spectatorship distinct from the colonial West to East dynamic, and unrestricted in this case by French arbitration and interference in the act of traveling to and gazing upon new landscapes. So most photography concerning Southeast Asia, as learned about in classrooms about colonial history, can be the work of French photographers' snapshots of colonial Indochina, in which indigenous people are subjects. However, in this photograph, we see two Lao people who are actively engaging in the making of a photograph of their own in their own national political social context. The second photograph shows senior monks from Laos on pilgrimage in January 1957, posing in front of the Taj Mahal in India, revealing how Lao monks drew from their own context to inform their photography of themselves in the world. The Lao monks as cosmopolitan and aware of their place in a global network of religion, culture, and people. And this photograph shows monks in complete control and agency of their positioning, and of Lao monks not only interacting with the non-Lao setting, but with a notable icon and tourist attraction like the Taj Mahal, which is a significant cultural site, but not part of the monastic lexicon. So the Taj Mahal is not Lao, but this photograph demonstrates that monks were not stationary subjects of a particular locale, but active tourists well aware of the world around them. They traveled independently to the Taj Mahal and consciously took a picture, not just of the Taj Mahal, but first and foremost of themselves in front of it. So this conscious self-insertion and the fact that no other arbiter, particularly Western arbiter, appears to be present in the making of this photograph, challenges viewers to reconcile and conceptualize a cosmopolitan lifestyle and framework, a path initiated by the Lao monks that occurs between the diverse groups residing within what we geopolitically define today as Asia. So these first two photographs, one of the photographer taking a picture of the other photographers, and this other kind of tourist photograph, these two alone reveal the ways that Lao monks experimented with and customized photography specific to their cultural beliefs and values, as well as how Lao monks were aware of the larger world and actively participated in the sightseeing of it as agents. So on one hand, autonomous photography then disrupts dominant ways of seeing a landscape. So the third and fourth selected photographs then provide examples of what autonomous photography generates, that is, what approaches to history and culture it constructs. So this photograph reveals that Lao monks were undeniably engaged in the political formation of Laos and in the documentation of that formation. Not only were monks photographing a political procession, but monks were actively involved in the procession alongside villagers and soldiers. As a group, monks lived separately but were not cut off, and they actively interacted with other social and political groups in Lao society. Rather than being spiritually above or beyond political matters concerning Lao nationalism and autonomy, Lao monks were actually part of the movements on the ground, invested in the politics of their present, and aware of their place in a larger collective Lao identity, not just through participation, but through documenting it, through actively using technologies to record it. So this photograph is from 1960 during the Lao Civil War, and the group of monks, villagers, and soldiers walk in explicit support of the communist Lao revolutionary forces. And lastly, just as important to witness as photographs of people are photographs that do not contain people at all, and what these aesthetic images construct concerning Lao monk identity, performance, and just beauty, what they consider beautiful. So the photograph here was taken by a monk who constructed and photographed his own light patterns for monastic rituals in Luang Prabang during the 1950s. One of these projects focused on capturing images of night illuminations and fireworks for the Buddhist celebration Bun Okwanza, or Festival of Light, in Luang Prabang's monasteries. So this picture, which is also public, as they all are on the Buddhist Archive website, is notable out of the selected photographs that have been analyzed, as I mentioned, because it's an image that does not contain any people. But this photograph stands apart as a celebration of aesthetic beauty. So just as the previous photograph of the march in support of the Pathet Lao helped build the image of politically engaged Laos and Lao Buddhism through the actions of Lao monks, both inside and outside the frame, the lights here demonstrate that the power of photography to construct identity lies not only in capturing human actions and capturing human bodies, but also in artisanship through human hands constructing cultural artifacts and symbols. The Strassler's idea that photographers in post-colonial Southeast Asia not only take pictures, but actually build the environments that they're captured in the images, holds great value when held up to this photograph. So remembering the authorship also imbues the photograph with the creative intention and spirit of the person behind it. So in conclusion, autonomous photography challenges the viewer to process what they see, not as a stationary image within comfortable boundaries of perception, but as a living artifact that challenges the viewer's own cultural norms. And the sampling of photographs already begins to illuminate the richness of the Buddhist archives collections. They spark generative conversations concerning intention, spirit, and power, and photographs that document a range of movements, from the political to the everyday to the festival. And while the content of these selected photographs vary, they share a common identity as organic products of the moments they represent, rather than flattened snapshots from an external point of view, which is then tinged with a presumption of detachment and caricature. So the Buddhist archive is a prime example of how autonomous photographs counter colonial and touristic gazes, and it speaks to the necessity of including such sources and pursuing the inclusion of such sources in historical studies of Southeast Asia and of world regions and peoples at large. So this concludes the presentation, and I want to thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Karis. I once again see the thread of taking control in defining yourself in relation to the world in paper 1, 2, and 4. So I'm really looking forward to all the discussions that are going to come out of this. Our final paper is by Otto Stuperitz from UCLA, Post-Custodial Processes at Irama Nusantara, Locating Strategies of Illegibility in the Preservation Practices of Grassroots Popular Music Archives.
Thank you so much for introducing me, and thank you so much for the organizers. We're almost there. It's been an amazing conference, and thank you so much for all your hard work. I really appreciate it. I've had a really great time. So yeah, this is my really wordy title. So there we go. In protected government radio collections in dusty antique malls in urban West Java, grassroots archivists of Irama Nusantara seek to preserve Indonesian popular music heritage. They do so by koleksi dan digitasi, collecting and digitizing commercial recordings not held elsewhere. I understand their process as fitting into broader archival trend of post-custodial methodologies. In archival science, post-custodial methodologies de-emphasize archival ownership and instead understand archivists as managers of collections. This process at Irama Nusantara entailed finding, then borrowing materials, preparing and cleaning them, digitizing the audio and scanning the physical media, documenting the metadata such as liner notes and disc numbers, and importantly, returning the physical materials to their owners, now with the addition of a digitized copy. Finally, they upload the digital materials to Irama Nusantara's free and publicly listenable website. Physical recordings are usually brought into the office for digitization, but the archivists also bring digitization equipment to collections. The archivists have digitized collections at Radio Republic Indonesia in Bandung, Jakarta, and Yogyakarta, the pre-1945 collection held in Bandung, and the Block M record sellers in South Jakarta. Irama Nusantara archivists do not claim any rights or ownership of the intellectual property and any long-term responsibility to the physical materials. The archivists take great care to develop social relationships and memorandums of understanding to gain access to safeguarded collections. In the process of sharing digitized commercial recordings, Erasmus Santara encounters copyright regulations regarding music distribution in Indonesia and as part of international information networks. Consequently, they upload lower quality streaming files with an educational, non-commercial license and include an easy takedown request policy to reduce piracy and profiteering. In this paper, I focus on Erasmus Santara's relationship to Indonesian copyright law. Their educational license is novel for sharing older recordings that have dubious copyright statuses. It is a way to share recordings with the public and also resist capture by the state and commercial enterprises. I start by more clearly defining post-custodial methodologies in terms of archival science, and then describe the ethnographic context of Erasmus Santara. I will then point out some important moments in the history of copyright in Indonesia, and finally show how the archivists negotiate this history. I argue Erasmus Santara's post-custodial methodology contains within it what James Scott would call a weapon of the weak, which strategically keeps intellectual property rights unstandardized and illegible in order to resist co-option. Erasmus Santara acts as the manager of digitized collections rather than the owner of physical and digital materials that stay within archival custody and responsibility. Archival scholars like Jeanette Bastian and Michelle Caswell have described the post-custodial paradigm as situations where archivists provide, quote, management oversight of archival materials. This is instead of archives accepting physical custody of records. The archivists actually borrow the materials, digitize them, describe them in a culturally appropriate manner, and then make them digitally accessible to anyone with an internet connection. I understand Erasmus Santara's Koleksi dan Digitasi as fitting within this methodology. My research of Erasmus Santara, located in South Jakarta, involved ethnographic experiences with its members. Even though the archive was officially established in 2011, these collectors turned archivists have been digitizing vinyl and sharing streaming music since 1998. They began broadcasting their collections via internet radio in 2009, a process that helped them learn about legal and technological scaffolding for future archive projects. The founding archivist members grew up participating in indie, punk, and hardcore communities of West Java and Jakarta as musicians, label owners, fans, and radio programmers. Many of them are also DJs who spin their personal vinyl for events, sometimes with the idea of socializing rare recordings for education, but more often for fun. The group's archival focus has been on the preservation and recirculation of any kind of Indonesian popular music, positioning them as well-known authorities on various styles, including dangdut and jazz. The politics of preserving jazz in Indonesia is the subject of my dissertation, which is how I got involved with this. So this is David Tarigan, who is one of the initiators of Erasmus Santara, and he explained to me the goals of the archive. He said, quote, "It is important for the archive to increase awareness for the public to know about modern Indonesian music as part of their national identity," end quote. This goal for increased awareness of Indonesia's modern music heritage in comparison to traditional music heritage sometimes runs counter to copyright regulations in Indonesia. To discuss these legal and cultural issues, Erasmus Santara spoke with this guy, Chandra Drusman, who is an Indonesian popular music and jazz musician who has also been the Indonesian representative to the World Intellectual Property Organization and a leading member of many Indonesian performing rights organizations, such as Bekraf. Drusman helped define the educational and non-commercial license in relation to Indonesian copyright law and supported Erasmus Santara's plan. So to understand the license, I will now survey the history of copyright in Indonesia. So bolded there, the most decisive moment in Indonesia's copyright history happened in 1958, when first President Sukarno guided Indonesia out of the Berne Convention. The 1886 Berne Convention was the first international agreement to establish standard copyright policies among sovereign nations. The Dutch East Indies, the former colonial power, had been a member since 1914. Leaving the Berne Convention follows the nationalist logics of Sukarno's isolationist martial law that started in 1957, which became the scaffolding for the anti-imperial guided democracy. So to understand the implications of this 1958 decision, let's return back to Drusman, who in 2016 interviews described the 1958 decision to leave the Berne Convention as, quote, "a time bomb when piracy in the recording industry went crazy. The decision to leave the Berne Convention meant that foreign works are not protected in Indonesia, not only music, but also books. When Darusman described a decision for allowing, quote, Indonesian people to take advantage of foreign works that advantage the music industry, he ultimately sees piracy as, quote, unethical. He then said, what is clear to me is that there is unpaid royalties, but regardless of ethics or not, Indonesia benefited, end quote. He described the decision to leave the Berne Convention as allowing the Indonesian music industry to, quote, be built on the violations of copyright infringement. This policy had long-term effects on the country's music industry, such as the lack of appreciation and knowledge of copyright and the lack of clear royalty distribution processes, end quote. He then ended the interview by saying that this was the cost of having freedom to duplicate foreign works in Indonesia. So the next large moment in Indonesian copyright history comes in 1985, when the musician and event organizer Bob Geldof criticized the Indonesian government for allowing the circulation of pirated tapes of the Live Aid concert. Although it was not technically illegal, since Indonesia was not a member of the Berne Convention and any international copyright convention, profiteering from a recording meant to benefit Ethiopian famine victims embarrassed Indonesian officials. So then in 1987, the government responded by amending their 1982 law to explicitly cover the copyright for these kinds of recordings. In 1997, Indonesia re-entered the Berne Convention as part of the more general re-entry into the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and which is also the end of the Suharto era. In 2002, the law was updated again, and then in 2014, which brought Indonesian copyright law closer to World Intellectual Property Organization standards. If anybody knows about the potential RUU 2018-2019 law, which would have substantially changed the situation, it failed to pass because of anti-state protests. A good thing in my mind. Even though the regulations have been updated several times, there has been weak enforcement that has allowed the piracy to continue. Darusman comments on the latest 2014 law. I think the new law is an improvement, but many things are included, such as longer protection period, the provisions for more professional agencies to regulate royalties, provisions for blocking illegal websites, as well as the return of copyright status to the songwriter. It was indeed an improvement. However, technology is not only a problem in Indonesian recording industry, but also globally. We know that there is a digital revolution. While in Darusman's opinion, the 2014 law has many improvements, distribution via technological platforms, which is the majority of distribution in Indonesia, remains an issue. So with this historical background, I turn back to Rama Nusantara, and this is an image that shows their practices from July 2019 that shows the distribution of their releases. They had 2,089 online releases from their total of 3,647 total archived recordings. We can see that the distribution of the original release dates is between mostly 1950 and 1980. This is the time period when Darusman would say there was a lack of appreciation of copyright law. So because of this, it is difficult to find the appropriate rights to distribute the recordings today. Contracts from those era did not include intellectual copyright and only specify what is called mechanical copyright for printed recordings and flat fee contracts for musicians. The intellectual property of musical recordings was not accounted for, or as I describe it, the intellectual property of these early recordings is illegible to the contemporary copyright regimes defined by contemporary national law. So in practice, Rama Nusantara archivists ascribe a moral right to these recordings by always contacting living musicians for their blessings to put the recordings online, even though this policy is now written into law. When looking for older rights bearers, Rama Nusantara looks for the recording companies and surviving musicians, but most companies no longer exist or have been sold several times, and the full list of musicians are usually not inscribed on the disc labels. It's rare, but not impossible, to find a recording company that still exists and all the musicians can be contacted. When such contact is possible, copyright can be sorted out through the 2014 regulations. Musicians and companies can collect royalties from digital streaming services and other points of sale. However, more often in the cases of older recordings, musicians have passed away and their rights have been handed to their families, usually without legally defining an owner. This often results in paralyzing disputes that prevent recordings from being re-released on online platforms. Without a clear way to sort out copyright, a non-commercial educational license with an easy takedown request is a very useful method to get music accessible and circulating again. So Ramana Santara's understanding of the history of copyright in Indonesia causes them to be somewhat ambivalent to solutions that do not meet their goal of increasing awareness of the modern Indonesian music. Making older recordings copyright friendly can help recording companies, the state, and international music industry to profit from online sales. But how does a legal copyright status increase awareness and accessibility to the Indonesian public? If a recording becomes copyright friendly, will that make it easier or harder to access? In Aram Nusantara's estimation, copyright regimes have not favored the Indonesian public. Even though they have these feelings, they still work with partners like Darusman and the government agency Bekraf to make memorandums of understanding to get access to the older recordings and government radio stations. While this collaboration, like most collaborations, entails different interests, its occurrence benefits Aram Nusantara. Their non-commercial educational license has become de facto legal through this collaboration. Importantly, because Aram Nusantara only acts as the manager of the digitized collections rather than the owners, the archive's property cannot be taken, since there is no property. Consequently, the state and commercial entities interested in these materials need to negotiate directly with the rights holders. The intellectual property over the recordings is kept illegible and unstandardized, whereby permission to use the recording remains unanswered, dispersed among a myriad of rights holders. This illegibility and lack of accountability in Aram Nusantara's process is a strategy to maintain opposition against state capture and against transforming the grassroots archivists into state-serving subjects. I argue that by leaving the copyright status of the archive's collection illegible, this post-custodial methodology serves as a practical approach to recirculate commercial recordings to the Indonesian public, while also discouraging appropriation by the state and capitalist music industry. Aram Nusantara's post-custodial methodology aligns the expectation of copyright on the national and international scale, and this allows the archive to circulate commercial and popular music heritage to their targeted end users. James Scott's later scholarship provides useful frames in understanding Aram Nusantara's politics. He deals with ideas of capture and standardization and taxation by the state, and escape and illegibility by subjects opposing state control. I relate this to anthropologist Anna Singh's use of friction, which notes the productive clashes of collaboration and highlights the lie that global power operates in a clean and disciplined manner. So Aram Nusantara embraces this friction as they collaborate with the government and business and their families, which often prevents recordings from being hosted online. So if we go back to these figures, over a third of their collection is not hosted online because of frictive reasons. So in my conclusion, the moment when Sukarno left the Berne Convention should be understood as a weapon of the weak, leveraged against international copyright regimes as a tool of the powerful. When Indonesia re-entered the Berne Convention in 1997, its past illegible history of copyright had not been resolved. Even though there are some, like Darusman, who work to smooth out Indonesian copyright law, when groups like Aram Nusantara work with old recordings, friction remains. The enduring friction of Indonesian musical copyright contains with it the resistance models of anti-imperialist politics. While copyright illegibility is usually framed pessimistically, that perception is a view of the powerful. I notice, as Sukarno did, how international copyright regimes have seldom been on the side of the Indonesian public. Thank you.
Thank you, Otto. We have about 10 minutes for questions and remarks. I'll open up the floor for this panel on adapting Asian art and performance. Congratulations to all who presented their wonderful research. Caitlin.
Thank you. So yeah, first of all, thank you so much, everybody. These were really interesting, fascinating presentations. I have a question for Elvis about your presentation. So towards the end of your presentation, I believe you were talking about the use of body technologies to define the idea of femaleness beyond a body. You also use body technologies. It's been a while since I've been kind of in the orbit of the drag community. When I was, there was the sense that there was a separation between these drag performers, their personas and themselves. They were still very much openly identified as gay men, and they had these personas that were almost separate from them, but a way for them to kind of express themselves in ways that they couldn't themselves, which is something you touched upon. In the last about 10 years, there's kind of been a growth in awareness and recognition of the transgender community. And there's been some confusion among many people about people who are not within the queer community or within that kind of orbit about the differences or the distinctions between a transgender woman who may or may not have undergone some sort of gender affirming surgery and a drag performer, and when they are in drag. So I wanted to know if this concept of body technologies as a way to kind of define femininity on stage, have you noticed when you were talking to the drag performers, was there any sort of problematization, I guess, in terms of whether or not they felt they needed to distinguish themselves from transgender women against people who really don't know the difference?
Thank you so much, ma'am, for that question. Basically, when drag performers wanted to identify themselves, usually they use their a third person pronoun, right? They wanted to have, it seems like their drag identity is separate from their male identity. Hence, when I talk to Filipino drag performers, and when they talk about the differences between like your question, basically, is it possible for trans to do drag, basically. And because when we talk about drag, usually a lot of people, especially the traditional ones, wanted to define drag as those males who wanted to dress as girls. That's why when you ask questions about can trans then perform gender using drag performances, I'm going to give an example. In the drag community, especially in the audience, for example, those fans in the fandom studies, for example, of the drag community, since they have a lot of followings in Instagram, for example, oftentimes we see a lot of individuals who wanted to dismiss transgender performers and wanted to separate them entirely from the drag community. And I'm going to give an example. In the reality television show RuPaul's Drag Race and in the Drag Den Philippines, for example, there have been only 2 participants who are identified as trans. That's why most of the time those organizers are oftentimes they are treated as transphobic, for example. Just like commonly, recently RuPaul was branded as a transphobic since she is not allowing trans community to perform, regardless, despite the fact that the trans community have produced a lot of very good drag, have contributed a lot in drag performances in the culture of gay community, for example. But in the Philippines, ma'am, for example, I have in my 2 years of observation in the gay bar, I apologize for the background noise. In my interviews in the gay bar community, there are trans performers and they are accepted as the drag queens, because when I asked them, what are your views then of transgendered communities performing drag, they wanted, most of the time, the response is, trans is who I am, drag is what I do. That's why in my interviews, I interviewed performers who are not, who are professionals, which means they get paid for being who they are, and still they are treated as queens in the stage, just like as equally as they were as the other drag queens are treated in the gay community, in the gay bar.
Thank you.
Yes, go ahead, Guandri.
Thank you so much. Can I ask a question to Elvis? Thank you so much for your presentation. So this is fascinating. But may I kind of like, could you please tell us more about these performers as people, or like what are their lives like? I understand like a central part of your project and their life is this gender, sexuality, but what about other parts of their life? Like if I meet this person, I don't know if this is anything you can share, but could you please help us like understand them, place them in a social context, like do they like what are their working conditions like? Do they get fair wage, like things like that? If there's anything you can share with us, thank you so much.
You're muted, Elvis, you're muted.
Sorry, thank you very much for the question, ma'am. I was able to do my study in drag performance because this is very personal to me. I'm also I also identify myself as a queer performer, and I've done drag when I was in high school, I think, and that's how I gained access to my identity of who I am right now. That's why I have a lot of connections in the drag community. And when I talk about the working conditions of the drag community, especially in the Philippines, the drag community in the Philippines is not accepted as compared to the Western counterparts of the drag community. Just in the United States, for example, in the Canada, or even in the Europe, we see a lot of drag franchises. That's why they have a lot of followings. But here in the Philippines, even if it's already an old industry, it started I think in the early 2000s until right now, there's still this idea that the Western drag community is the standard form of drag in the drag culture. That's why a lot of drag communities here in the Philippines, drag performers, have this idea of catching up to that standard in the Western. They have a lot of body technologies in the Western because they have a lot of access to audience because they give tips, and that's why when they have a lot of access to audience who have a lot of tips to give to these performers, oftentimes they can buy a lot of body technologies to be to look feminine. But here in the Philippines, the working condition is not as great, especially because right now the political community or the political atmosphere here in the Philippines, it's not as accepting for the LGBT, because we have a lot of leaders, for example, in our government who are explicitly asking the gay community to tone it down. But that's not the drag community. That you cannot tone down the body technologies here in the drag community because they often exaggerate the female aspects of the feminine side. That's why the working community, it's a struggle because they can only come out in the evening because that's how gay bars operate here. But in the morning, they are treated as the normal ones. That's why in my interviews, I said that I'm no longer the bullied Michael. I am Michelle. I'm gorgeous and I'm accepted here in the stage, and the stage is my world. So that's the working condition of the drag performances. Thank you for the question, ma'am.
Thank you so much for a great answer. Thank you so much.
Otto?
Yeah, my question's also for Elvis. I guess it was very generative. Pretty early on, you talked about your method of binge watching, which I thought was super interesting, actually. And I kind of wonder, I think you were talking in a very practical sense, and I kind of understand what you're saying, but I feel like for your theory of like repetitive watching and like world making, I kind of wonder, I don't know if it's been used or if other scholars have kind of like taken binge watching, but I just kind of was like a very like provocative method, which I think actually is relatable across like this kind of project, but all sorts of projects. And I was just wondering, I mean, it's kind of for you and maybe for everyone, but this kind of idea of binge watching in this setting is both, as you're saying, noticing drag communities outside, but then also maybe binge watching your own community, anything like that. It's kind of a funny idea.
I was able to add binge watching RuPaul's Drag Race and other Drag Race franchises in the West as my method, since I do not have that access to the mainstream popular culture drag competition. That's why I was able to look at the comparison between how the fans of Drag Race, how the fans of Drag Race treat the Filipino American drag performers or competitors in RuPaul's Drag Race from America, and how they accept those drag performers locally in the Philippines. That's why I added binge watching as my method, since that's the only access like I can have on how the Filipino American drag performers were accepted compared to the local native Filipinos who are born and raised here in the Philippines. But right now, sir, that's why I included my study that this year there will be 2 drag competitions here in the Philippines. And it's interesting how that will play in the Western franchise, because the Western franchise has a lot of fandom. And as I said, there's a lot of, it was the standard of how the drag should be, how drag performers should look like. That's why I'm looking forward to having the 2 reality competition, Drag Race and Drag Den, here in the Philippines, on how it will play out in the drag community. Thank you, sir.
Caitlin, do we have a few more minutes? Is this the last panel? Can we go a little bit over?
Yeah, we can go a little bit over. I would say, Tasha, we can do another like 5 to 6 minutes if anybody has any more questions.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah. Okay. Griffin.
I have another question for Elvis, if you're not if you're not too tired after all this.
Griffin, sorry. Does anybody else have questions for any other panelists? Let me do that first.
I can ask Carice a question. I don't.
Sorry,
have a
Griffin.
really-
I'm so sorry. I didn't
Sorry.
mean- I'm just trying to make sure that everybody gets a chance. Sorry, but you will. Caitlin.
So, Carice, you were kind of your methodology was focusing on this kind of historical set of photographs. Is there, so Laos is a country that kind of, at least from my understanding, compared to a lot of other nations in mainland Southeast Asia, is a little closed off. Is there, do the monastic communities currently, like the contemporary monastic communities in Laos, have they produced any photography in recent years that kind of acts as a good comparison to these kind of historic photos?
Yeah, the last time I really stepped in with the archive, it was just a big effort of basically uncovering all of the photographs that had not been discovered. So I think the current process, as far as I know, is continuing to find all the photographs that were taken by predecessors. I don't know so much about how robust photography is like today, and kind of wondering if photography as a medium holds the same significance now, depending on how, I guess, maybe quote unquote commonplace it's become. But yeah, I think that the intent of the archive, kind of the founding aspect of it, was because it was a really big deal to realize that there are so many photographs that had been taken within like the monasteries themselves. And that kind of, it was really a few monks partnering together to make sure that all this stuff was archived. That doesn't quite answer the question about the present, but I think it holds on to like the symbolic aspect of the past.
Thank you. Yeah, I wasn't sure if if there was any kind of way to even know, but curious if there was like a continuation, kind of a continuing thread that connects the past to the present.
Griffin.
Yeah, so Elvis, so I'm thinking about how, so like recently it seems to me that especially in the US, like queer culture, drag culture has increasingly become like mainstream to the point where like RuPaul's Drag Race is like so popular. It's on Hulu and like a lot of people are watching it. And it's not underground anymore. It's not like only in the queer community underground that is able to experience this. So like comparatively, like, you know, the show Pose on Netflix, which is about like the queer community in New York City during the AIDS crisis and how they would perform balls for each other, where they would do these performances. And the way that they portray it, you know, in the show, if it's historically accurate, right, is that it's like only that community is really like there. You're performing for your community. It's like that's where their community is, like that's where their lives are. And then in a show like Legendary, which just came out recently on HBO Max, where they're taking the balls and they're making it for everyone, like everybody can come and see this, you know, and how it's gone from underground, only the queer community, to like mainstream, it's for everybody. I'm curious, like, how you think maybe the body technologies, like the way of subverting gender, has changed as it's gone from like, we're only performing for other queer people who like understand, to like mainstream, this is for everybody, come and understand if you want to.
I think the idea of using body technology in the past, as I have observed, is even here in the Philippines, in our community, even if we don't call it the drag, dressing as girl or drag performance, we have a lot of like Miss Universe competitions, beauty pageants, wherein competitors are identified as gays or transgenders. That's why they and in their performances they do lip syncs, which means that, and they also have a lot of like house names, right? Like they can adopt those who do not have the family, and then they'll adopt their own identity as a separate identity as a drag performer. And I think the importance of using body technology is it changed how it changed the way that a lot of performers perform genders. That's why in my paper I use the term as using body technology to offer multiple or various gendered identities, because in the past those who are only accepted are those who are able to achieve that standard Western look, which means that you need to look as feminine, and they use a lot of blonde wigs, for example, and they use a lot of stilettos that are at par to the brands in the West, for example. But because of body technologies, a lot of drag performers are able to access identities that are not Western looking. Say, for example, you have the Dragula, or here in the Philippines, we see a lot of drag performers who use monstrous bodies. Like here we have a lot of folklores. Like you have the Manananggal, wherein it's a woman with only the upper torso, and they identify themselves as drag performers since they also challenge the notion of the notion of gender and sexuality, and they make jokes about gender and sexuality. That's why I think the importance of body technology is a lot of queer performers can now have access to not just the singular mainstream drag looking persona, but right now they can localize their own drag looks, and they can also perform drag performances using local and traditional looks that are not common to what you see in mainstream drag performances.
Thank you.
I have so many things to say, but I'm not going to. But I will. Anybody else has questions? So I'm going to say a couple of things to end this panel. One, Elvis, at the recent Association of Asian Studies International conference that just happened in Honolulu, there was a big event. There was a drag performance as an official event of the conference. And I know the person who arranged it and did it. So if you want to have a connection here, I can help you get in touch with that person. Griffin, I'm sorry I cut you off, but I also have a joke for you. Which I told Dr. J the other day on Saturday. There's a Buddhist monk and a frustrated businessman sitting next to each other, and the frustrated businessman says, nothing makes sense. And the Buddhist monk says, doesn't it? So that's my Buddhist joke for you.
That's great.
Guanrui, I teach a language. I teach Hindi and Urdu. Both have different scripts, and script learning is a different, is an imaginative experience for my students. So I can relate to the fact that when I teach my scripts, I try to tell my students to have this kind of imagination activated as they are trying to not just learn the script, but find beauty in it. So we kind of look at, oh, this looks like a peacock, or that looks like a monkey hanging from the tree, or and that, I think that's it's a kind of sort of imaginative, childlike imaginative exercise that naturally is employed in not just kind of learning process, but re-enchanting the learning process. So I didn't have a question, but that's a comment I had. For Karis, I was thinking, I was intrigued by your terminology, you're coining the term autonomous photography. And I was, as a philosopher, I'm always thinking, why and what is the exact need in order to create theoretical terms? You don't have to answer this question, but I'm basically wondering about saying autonomous photography as opposed to taking their own photographs, asserting themselves, etc., right? So the need to create terminology, and especially in the context of academia, because we kind of engage in these games of creating buzzes around the terms that we create. And finally, for Otto, because I'm also a choreographer, I'm always very, very frustrated in the game of copyright. And I always think about the fact that it feels like water everywhere, not a drop to drink. It's because everybody I see on Instagram, YouTube, everybody using all sorts of music, but when I have to perform, I can't get rights at all. And then, but it's an interesting restriction, because then when it sends you over to a path that you did not have plans for, it creates another beautiful set of restrictions that change the form of art you're creating. But thank you for bringing that aspect and pulling at my strings, as it were. If there are no other comments, no other questions, thank you so much for this beautiful panel and really engaging and thought-provoking, and hopefully you'll be in touch. Everybody has everybody's emails, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so if you want us, you can share your email in the chat here if you want to. Tasha and I are also going to, we're going to kind of set out a Discord and see if we can collect all the participants' contact information. So if there's any panels you saw during the last 2 days, and anybody you want to get in contact with if you're interested in the research, you just want to talk to them, we'll have a way for you to do that.
Ashwini, you have something to say?
Yes, thank you so much for this thing. Actually, I really like this panel because this is actually totally new for me. So it's kind of very interesting for me. I was just like wondering, like, especially the drag queen concept and all, because in Taiwan after 2019, there are a lot of seminars and like a lot of talks I've been seeing. Because since 2019, Taiwan is actually legalizing the sex marriage, and so many LGBT issues and drag queen, these issues are emerging. So it's kind of interesting to see the different field of interest and everything. And also I like all the papers, and I really enjoy the script paper, because when I learn Chinese, traditional Chinese in Taiwan, it's kind of very interesting for me, because I'm actually from Tamil Nadu, so it's kind of a Tamil and the Chinese is totally kind of different, and it's very interesting for me to learn. So I really enjoyed that presentation. So I could feel that how the language is not just like something logic or something, it's like more creative, and it's very interesting. I really enjoyed the panel. Thank you so much for everyone.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. So I think with that, we will conclude our final panel, panel 8. But again, thank you, everyone. Great discussions. And it was so interesting to watch all of your presentations. And we'll be having a short break before we start our final event, which is the closing, which Caitlin and I will be giving some closing remarks along with our department chair, Dr. Catherine Clayton. Thank you all.
I'm going to take a picture.
Okay.
1, 2, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, Tasha, are you